Good evening and welcome to the presidential address. My name is Thavolia Glymph, and I am president-elect of the American Historical Association. Thank you. Thank you very much. This evening, it's my honor and a great delight to introduce Edward Wallace Muir, Jr., President of the American Historical Association. Professor Muir is a Clarence L. Versteeg Professor in the Arts and Sciences at Northwestern and a leading scholar of Italian social and cultural history in the early modern period. He comes to us to the presidency of the AHA, having already served as president and vice president of the Renaissance Society of America and of the 16th Century Society and Conference. His election as president of the AHA is evidence of the esteem with which he is held by colleagues not only in his field, but across the many historical fields of study in which we, our members, engage. Professor Muir is the author of 4 monographs, 4 edited collections, and dozens of articles and book chapters, as well as a well-regarded and popular textbook. This does not include many shorter pieces and review essays. The intellectual space and the contributions of this body of work is centered in a small place, Venice. But Venice is merely the intellectual ground for the study of big ideas about community and ritual, about identity formation, questions that we all confront in one way or another. Professor Muir's work treats us to ways of thinking and ways of knowing that are not merely fascinating, as they are, but instructive, and particularly so, it seems to me, in today's world, where we too often forget the long history of ritual's part in identity and community formation. He makes it easier for us to see and to understand, because in his work, the theoretical is brave and expansive, but is also braced, held up with archival authority. And its interdisciplinary character is bravely interpretive. This is true whether he's talking about the opera or the Virgin Mary. Professor Muir's body of work is too extensive to address in an introduction because we want to leave time for him to deliver his address. But I do want to say, I'm not a scholar of his era or of Venice or Europe, but I do want to say, something, just a word about the impact of one of his books on me. That book, Mad Blood Stirring, Vendetta and Factions in Friuli During the Renaissance, published by Hopkins in 1993, which also received the AHA's Helen Howard Mararo Prize in Italian History. This is microhistory at its best. It's the kind of microhistory that helped me better understand and frame a lot of my thinking, and in particular, a book that I'm currently working on, where writing about the question of moments of transition looms very large. It is rare that I have encountered someone who knows Ed, who does not mention his generosity, who does not mention his commitment to undergraduate students and graduate students, who does not mention his commitment to teaching. He is a scholar who writes, but he's also, maybe even more so, a teacher. And of course, these are two inseparable things in his academic life. as is evident in the 216 Vestscript volume. So when I think of Ed, I think of culture wars, I think of the late Renaissance, I think of rituals and libertines and opera, and so much more, even though this is not an era, as I mentioned, that I particularly study. I think of big ideas delivered in the most engaging way. I think of theoretical sophistication that doesn't shout out its name, but theoretical sophistication that captures your mind. I think of a historian with whom I, as a scholar of the 19th century, have learned from and will continue to learn from. Finally, I must say what a pleasure it has been over the last year to work with and learn from Ed. We have meetings every 2 weeks, and I have enjoyed not only having the opportunity to read more about what he does and what he writes, I have enjoyed his wit, and I have been inspired by his intellectual acumen. Thank you.
Thank you, Thavolia. May I invite people to move in a little bit? There's all kinds of people standing in the back, and that doesn't seem very comfortable to me, at least. I don't know how they feel. If you could slide in a little bit and make it possible for some people to come in and get a seat. And there are some seats up front. I know no one wants to sit up front, but have you ever seen a student show up to class and sit in the front row first day? Doesn't usually happen. Can you hear me all right? On December 10th, 1513, Niccolò Machiavelli composed what has become the most famous letter from the Italian Renaissance. He was writing to his friend Francesco Vettori, the Florentine ambassador in Rome, from his suburban farm outside Florence, far from the gossip, intrigue, and tussles over policy that had been his food for so long. After the execution of the pseudo-prophet Girolamo Savonarola some 15 years before, Machiavelli had thrived in the lion's den of Florentine politics as an undersecretary and virtuoso diplomat. But Medici family mediocrities purged him in 1512 in their violent takeover of the Florentine Republic. An ardent Republican, Machiavelli was as skeptical of religious fanatics like Savonarola as he was of the self-aggrandizing bankers and parvenu aristocrats like the Medici, who sought to rule his city. When his name appeared on a list of anti-Medici conspirators, he was arrested, tortured, and exiled. In the famous letter, he sought to retain the favor of his friend, ever mindful that Vettori had the pull to make it possible for the job-seeking former secretary to leave my country home, as he put it, and say, "Here I am." Until that happened, he was stuck, catching thrushes to feed his family, trying to scrape together a living by selling timber from a woodlot, and entertaining himself for the afternoon by playing cards in a tavern with an innkeeper, butcher, miller, and 2 bakers. He was caught, as he put it, among these lice, and my feeling of being ill-treated by fate. When evening comes, I return to my home and I go into my study. And on the threshold, I take off my everyday clothes, which are covered with mud and mire, and I put on regal and curial robes. And dressed in a more appropriate manner, I enter into the ancient courts of ancient men and am welcomed by them kindly. And there I taste the food that alone is mine and for which I was born. And there I am not ashamed to speak to them, to ask them the reasons for their actions, and they, in their humanity, humanità, answer me. and for 4 hours I feel no boredom, I dismiss every affliction. I no longer fear poverty, nor do I tremble at the thought of death. I become completely part of them. Now, Machiavelli alerted his friend to what would become the most elegant yet failed job application in history, that little book called The Prince. He hoped the book would spur these Medici lords, as he put it, to make use of me even if they started me off by rolling stones. In the letter, Machiavelli evoked the Renaissance trope of conversing with the dead ancients. It was the same metaphor Francesco Petrarch conjured when he wrote a nasty letter to the Roman orator Cicero, who had been dead for 1,388 years, because Cicero failed to live up to his own advice about political ethics. Petrarch wrote as if he expected a reply, complete with a description of his location in terms that Cicero might have understood. And as Anthony Grafton noted in his American Historical Association presidential address about Francis Daniel Pastorius, the erudite German emigre to colonial Pennsylvania, the trope persisted among the learned for centuries. Embedded in the metaphor of a conversation with the dead, however, is more than an artifact of what would become the Republic of Letters, which imagined a literary discussion with the classical masters who wrote in Greek and Latin. It implies a fundamental historical method. As Machiavelli wrote, I am not ashamed to speak to them, to ask them the reasons for their actions, and they, in their humanity, answer me. More than the modern historian's commonplace that we seek to bring the past back to life for our readers and students, Conversations with the Dead imagine a give and take, questions from us, answers from them, pursued in an imaginative space carefully controlled by the documents until we, as Machiavelli wrote, become completely part of them. I want to propose that such an imaginative space begets a certain kind of historical method that demands we ask the right questions of our dead interlocutors in the hopes of learning the right answers. Much of the historical and theoretical literature from the Renaissance appeared in carefully crafted dialogues or open-ended rhetorical discussions among the living, imagined persons, and often the dead. Modern historians, however, would risk professional suicide by following this dialogic form, leaving all the possible arguments without resolution. We must decide what we think the dead meant, despite the differences in language, time, and culture that separate us. Now, what is the method? The conversations with the dead require a certain time and place, much like a ritual, I think. Machiavelli's evening leisure in his private study became the ancient courts of ancient men who welcomed him kindly to taste the food that alone is mine and for which I was born. The result of the conversation was a certain understanding. It was an engagement with the humanity of the long dead. For Machiavelli, at least, the conversation resulted in catharsis and the purgation of stress. For 4 hours, I feel no boredom. I dismiss every affliction. I no longer fear poverty, nor do I tremble at the thought of death. I become completely part of them. His understanding becomes, to put it in modern terms, the identification between historians and their subjects. I must admit that I, along with many of my colleagues, many of them here in Italian history, tend to identify with Machiavelli because he understood the dilemmas of his time better than anyone else, because his lucid prose makes his world come alive, because his commitment to republican virtue over princely tyranny suits our modern biases. Sitting in my study, reading my documents, seems akin to his taste, as he put it, for the food for which he was born. Now, identification, however, is risky. By becoming part of someone else, we may achieve some understanding, but lose the capacity for judgment and lose the very advantage of distance that historians have long claimed makes our judgments better than those who came before us, the morning news, or the latest political rant. As Jules Lepore discovered while stroking a lock of Noah Webster's hair, kept in an envelope at Amherst College Library, finding out and writing about people, she put it, living or dead, is tricky work. It is necessary to balance intimacy with distance, while at the same time being inquisitive to the point of invasiveness. Now, there's also the danger of what might be called the mirror effect, or seeing oneself in the documents rather than the distant, distinct, different past. Mirror, mirror in my documents, which of my ideas is the fairest of all. As a historian, I've had the ambition to pursue a kind of dead history, a realm of the truly dead, not a reflection of me or my concerns, but that ambition harbors an illusion. The inhabitants of the historical past are very often reflections in a distorted mirror of the present, a kind of funhouse mirror even of myself. In Dead Certainty, Simon Schama faced up to what he said was the habitually insoluble quandary of the historian: how to live in two worlds at once, how to take the broken, mutilated remains of something or someone from the enemy lines of the documented past and restore it to life, or give it the decent interment in our own time and place. Now, despite the dangers of identification or the mirror of effect, presiding over a conversation with the dead can be the source of the greatest pleasure in our craft. It is in those occasional moments of enlightenment, even purgation, when I think the dead have answered my questions and I understand their responses. Now, in this talk, I wanted to restore a bit of life to the past by recounting 4 kinds of conversations I have had with the dead. These people lived in the 15th to 17th centuries in Italy. Italy, of course, did not yet exist as a country, and the Tuscan tongue had not yet established itself as the lingua franca of the peninsula. The first conversation is with a marginally literate family of Sienese peasants who lived on the borders of the urban Renaissance with its intense emphasis on literacy and writing of all sorts. They spoke Tuscan Italian, even if they could not write it. The second conversation is with a group of thoroughly illiterate peasants who lived in the backwater region of Friuli, far away from the urban Renaissance of Siena, and who had communicated to me, and who have communicated to me through the records of their annual payments in kind to their landlords, or more often, their failure to pay their contracted rents, and through their ritualized violence in moments of insurrection. Their language was one of action, of submission or protest, and as speakers of Friulano, the Tuscan Italian of Siena was utterly foreign. The third conversation is with an involuntary nun, Suor Arcangela Tarabotti, who lived in 17th century Venice and who wrote in Venetian Italian with the intensity of a woman imprisoned by the circumstances of her life. She failed to find very much sympathy or many readers in her lifetime. But in the past few decades, however, her works have been adopted into the feminist canon, and we've heard about her even today. The fourth is with her even more radical contemporary in Venice, Ferrante Pallavicino, a restless friar who, writing the more universal Italian, became the most popular satirist of his age. He was an ardent critic of the clerical establishment and perhaps even an unbeliever who paid the price for offending the powerful religious with his life. Now, my first 2 conversations with the dead are the most difficult to sustain because these dead souls can barely answer the questions I want to ask, not because they want for Machiavelli's prize humanity, but because they lacked full literacy. Yet their thoughts, deeds, sufferings, and loves form the most fertile soil in history. I want to converse with these peasants who lived for the most part without books, paper, and ink, but who inhabited the fringes of that first great urbanized literature culture in Europe. The late Sicilian novelist Leonardo Sciascia threw down the gauntlet. For the peasants, he wrote, history does not exist. But what about my father? What about your father and the rumbling of their empty bellies, the voice of their hunger? Do you believe this will be heard in history, that there will be a historian with an ear keen enough to hear? I've wanted to be that historian, but it's hard to do, I must admit. Nevertheless, the ubiquity of written records in Italy makes it possible, even indirectly, to hear the voices of the peasants who face the travails of weather and the market. The task for the historian is to work out a method for hearing those voices. My initial questions have tended towards the mundane details of farm life and the challenges created by the forces external to the farm, those exploitative lords, pillaging soldiers, and changing labor conditions, such as the transition from serfdom to leasing land or to sharecropping. The medievalist from the University of Siena, Duccio Balastracci, has made my first conversation possible through his transcription and publication of 2 parchment-bound farming diaries kept by generations of a peasant family who lived in the environs of Siena in central Tuscany in the late 15th and 16th centuries. They could not write themselves, but asked others to make notations in the diaries for them. The diaries, in fact, are written in the hands of 30 different people. The most diligent diarist of the family, Benedetto del Masarizia, worked his own fields, but rented and sharecropped others, making him both a freeholder and a sharecropper. Most of what he wrote concerned small transactions. Benedetto di Cristofano Palmieri exchanged with us 1 heifer for an old ox, and he owes us a heifer. And we agreed that we would pay him 21 lire in addition to the heifer. That's pretty typical. Now, my historical training has led me to take a dim view of sharecropping as an exploitative agricultural system that did not allow peasants to accumulate the rewards of their labor. But in our historical conversation, Benedetto disagreed with me. He was a crafty businessman who entered into sharecropping, what is called in Italian mezzadria, contracts for the modest income they produced, as a hedge to protect the plots he owned outright from creditors. For Benedetto, sharecropping was a kind of income insurance. If rampaging soldiers or bad weather destroyed his crops, he would then owe the landlord only half of what he could salvage, rather than a full loan due to the moneylenders upon whom he had to rely between planting and harvest for his own freehold. With an elderly mother, 5 boys and 2 girls to feed, Benedetto saw advantages to sharecropping. As he put it, since I want to support them, it is best for me to remain a sharecropper, for on my own land I cannot support myself. He also harvested wheat and other grains, made wine, pressed olives, sold wood, pastured pigs, fueled his most lucrative investment, a lime kiln. To use the modern jargon, he diversified his portfolio. He was, of course, a subaltern whose diary constituted what we might call a weapon of the weak, but this enterprising farmer managed to keep his creditors at bay. It was a close-run race from destitution. In fact, his brother left an impoverished widow, unable to provide their daughter with a dowry. And within 2 generations, all of Benedetto's toil and worry came to naught as his progeny lost it all. Now, my second conversation is with peasants from the impoverished region of Friuli who faced starvation and the scourge of war between 1509 and 1511. Unlike the landowning and entrepreneurial Benedetto del Masarizzi in Vienna, they had little choice but to rebel against their aristocratic landlords, and they did so beginning in 1509. A little more than a decade before that uprising, Ottoman raiders had enslaved thousands and stripped the region of food. Then, just before the uprising, war broke out between the Holy Roman Empire and the Republic of Venice, swarming the villages with mercenaries bent on pillage. Lacking the peasant diary that gave me an interlocutor in Siena, I had to resort to the rent rolls of the aristocratic landlords to find faint echoes of the voices of the peasants. The rolls of the Colloredo estate in the tiny village of Sterpo, home to 29 families in 1509, are especially rich and complete. The roll for each year lists the name of every tenant family, what rents were due, and what they managed to deliver to the steward. Unlike in Tuscany, sharecropping was not an option in Friuli. Instead, peasants leased their plots and paid a fixed annual rent in kind that invariably overvalued the productive capacity of the land, so that the tenants were chronically behind in their payments. Paolo Camarazano's equipe of researchers at the University of Trieste found that between, and this is an earlier period slightly, 1371 and 1453, for example, only 67% of the wheat, 66% of the oats, and 59% of the millet due to the landlords in the region were ever paid. Although no longer serfs and technically free to sell their labor to the highest bidder, these permanently indebted peasants survived at the sufferance of the landlord who could evict them at any time. Now, to understand more about the peasants' travails, I sought interlocutors in the archives and asked them my historian's questions. Their answers were indirect, desperate whisperings of suffering in the otherwise silent records. The closest I can come to a real conversation with these dead has been in many ways imaginary, generating not proofs, but historical possibilities, to borrow the words of Natalie Zeman Davis. Chronic indebtedness in Sterpo became acute when rents came due in July 1509. Barely 1 in 10 of the Colloredo tenants paid a full rent, and about 2/3 paid nothing at all. The peasants' muffled voices appear in terse notes in the steward's hand. Agreed that he not pay. He owes past rents. He owes for the last years. He owes all the past rents. She owes. They owe. At a tense moment, when the local peasant militia of Sterpo was drilling in the village green, they seized an opportunity, charged across the castle bridge, and pillaged and burned the castle. As the rent roll from 4 years later put it, quote, the castle, mills, and houses that were in that place were ruined at that time when the nobles were persecuted by the peasants. And in fact, a company has recently contracted to create a video game based on this event. So I'll see whether they can make it come to life better than I can. The loudest cry from the peasants of Sterpo, however, emerges from the silences of the subsequent records. After 1509, the peasant families of Sterpo began to disappear. 29 in 1509, 13 in 1510, and only 6 by 1513. More than 3/4 of the tenants vanished. What happened? Were the rebels driven off the land? Did many starve? Did pillaging soldiers deliver the coup de grace? I have to admit, I do not know. There is a clue from the peasant parliament, which promulgated in November 1509, 11 articles on behalf of the villages of Friuli, and put into words what may have motivated the Sterpo rebels. The articles are all about economic grievances by farmers. They lacked, however, the religious language that Martin Luther had given to the German peasants who revolted in 1525, a revolutionary substance based on the doctrine of the freedom of all Christians. Facing the limits of a conversation with the dead, I hear the clamor of the protest and imagine the suffering, but little else. Now, from the violent but mostly inarticulate cries of peasants, I move ahead a century and pass to the baggy verbiage of two 17th century literary rebels. Whereas peasant rebels lacked access to the literary world, most 17th century Italian intellectuals, inhibited by the surveillance of the Holy Office and the Habsburg hegemony, almost everywhere in the peninsula except for Venice, lacked the capacity for revolutionary action. As the great 17th century Venetian polemicist and political theorist Paolo Sarpi put it, when valiant men write, it is a sign that they cannot act. Venetian women and men wrote with a passionate logorrhea during the 17th century, known more so than these two intellectuals, Suor Arcangela Tarabotti and Ferrante Pallavicino, who were both encumbered by religious vows, which they did their best to ignore. For them and other contemporary literary figures, Venice offered an island of intellectual freedom where, as one literary scholar has put it, words were not separate from facts, even as rhetorical conventions, self-censorship, and the necessary circumlocutions for publication often tugged words away from facts. Conversing with peasants relies on social reconstruction. Conversing with intellectuals relies on literary analysis. Penetrating the roundabout prose of late Renaissance and Baroque writers, who had to insinuate rather than declare meaning, presents a different kind of challenge from reconstructing the lives, feelings, and thoughts of the illiterate from agricultural records. In both cases, keeping the conversation going with the dead, keeping the conversation with the dead going leaves us perhaps doomed to be forever hailing someone, as Simon Schama has put it, who has just gone around the corner and out of earshot. Conversations with the dead are about capturing, perhaps only in a metaphoric way, those few moments of understanding among people when we appreciate what and who the other was. Although the conversations I am rehearsing are no more than metaphors, historians, of course, often think through metaphors. We write about revolutions, a metaphor borrowed from astronomy, as in the dramatic intellectual challenge initiated by Nicholas Copernicus's book On the Revolutions of the Heavenly Spheres from 1543, or about crises, a metaphor borrowed from medicine. Born in 1604 to an upper middle class, what is called in a Venetian cittadino family in Venice, Elena Cassandra Tarabotti, known to us by the name she acquired with her monastic vows, Suor Arcangela Tarabotti, suffered the fate of many young women in the 17th century when she was confined to a convent at the age of 11 or 13. She gives us different dates, different ages. With a pronounced limp that her father believed made her unmarriageable, and with 5 sisters in need of dowries, Tarabotti found herself abandoned by her own family. She had little contact with them in later life, stating that they had imprisoned her in convent hell, the title of her first book. Now, a rather reluctant inmate, she was not afraid to reveal her feelings. Her most dangerous thoughts were unpublishable during her lifetime, and her convent hell did not find print until 1990. And the edition that I consulted was privately printed in Italian in Moni, Illinois, of all places, in 2021. Her major polemic, Paternal Tyranny, was also unpublishable during her lifetime, appearing 2 years after her death from a Protestant publisher under the suitably non-threatening title Naivete Betrayed, with the authorial pseudonym Gallerana Baratotti, an anagram of Arcangela Tarabotti. Now, Tarabotti's cri de coeur was both personal and theoretical. She lamented the fate of young Venetian girls whose fathers, quote, do not offer the most beautiful and virtuous brides to Jesus, but the most repellent and deformed. And if in their family there are daughters who are lame, hunchbacked, or crippled, or idiotic by natural deficiencies rather than by any fault of their own, they are condemned to prison for the rest of their lives. Abandoned daughters found themselves in convents that take the place of a ship's bilge, where fathers cast all their filthy refuse and then boast of having offered up a sacrifice, even to the point of adorning the brows of illegitimate daughters, often born of adulterous liaisons, with holy veils. Fathers and brothers, not wanting to empty their coffers and deprive themselves of their comforts, allowed only one daughter at home and condemned the rest to the intricate labyrinth enclosing them. The women were forced to dwell in lifelong prisons, where the memory of those things lost was a constant torment. Now, in convent hell, she described the lugubrious celebration of her own vows, in which she prostrated herself on the floor, tasting the cold stone with her mouth, while a black cloth was thrown over her head. She felt as if she were attending her own funeral, which of course she was symbolically. To her, the ceremony was a tragedy played by emblematic characters: fraud, pretense, hypocrisy, deceit, and betrayal. Of all the ceremonial sacrifices required of the new inmate, none seemed as deeply hurtful to her womanhood as the one that took place after her vows, when her head was shaved of the thick tresses she had enjoyed since childhood. Tarabotti goes on, and there she reverts to Latin. Omnis homo medax, all men are liars, she says. All men lie on every occasion, but when they assassinate a girl with these miseries, they lie and betray her even more. They promise her magnificent and sumptuous furnishings for her cell, all that is beautiful and gracious from home, saying, all of this will be yours. But these are false promises, and no one loves a liar. Not only must cloistered women give up matrimony, but also they are deprived of all the pleasures of fine clothing, jewelry, and all the things that delight the eye and stimulate the spirit. The waters of memory flow, but the young girls cannot taste a single drop for the remainder of their lives. Indoctrinated with 1,000 lies, they can never go beyond the convent walls because fathers say it is not honorable for a daughter to go roaming about. The fathers say in a small garden is just as fine as a grand villa, making everything in the world look the same. Mothers go along with this farce, utterly failing to recognize the disproportionate effect of imprisonment in comparison to the risks that freedom threatened to their daughter's honor. Now, Tarabotti's lament rose above the personal to the political, to a political critique of the reason of state, based on the insight that the injustices inflicted on girls and women were a structural feature of, as she put it, the defense, preservation, and expansion of the state. With her characteristic irony, she proposed a solution many decades before Jonathan Swift's modest proposal about selling poor Irish children as food for the rich. Instead of imprisoning girls, she suggested, boys should be killed at birth, allowing only one surviving male per family, a lesser tragedy than burying girls alive. She concluded, "My words are in no way intended to besmirch religion, but instead to rail against the fathers and relatives who violently put their daughters in coffins. I do not want to beg you to believe my sincerity, since in any case, for one who has lost her liberty, there is nothing more to lose." Nourished by her personal sense of betrayal and her double alienation from her family and the larger society of Venice, Tarabotti analyzed patriarchy in historical, legal, and structural terms. To prevent family anarchy, fathers felt obliged to maintain strict surveillance of their daughters and to lock up the unmarried ones at home or in a convent. Now, although Venice did not ground its laws in legal codes from Roman law, which were guaranteed that the authority of the patriarch was sustained, the city also did follow the social strictures of upper-class Italian society and symbolically linked family structures to the authority of the state. With its habits of wasting the fertility of its daughters, to borrow Jutta Sperling's analysis, Venice went further than other states in the Catholic world by confining unprecedented numbers of young women in convents. By the time Tarabotti took her vows, perhaps 1/3 to a half of middle and upper class Venetian women had been confined into convents, leaving many frustrated young women with good reasons for behaving badly. By the middle of the 17th century, these structural trends, magnified by dowry inflation and a rigid insistence on maintaining the genetic purity of the ruling class by legally prohibiting marriages outside of the nobility, vastly reduced the number of potential marriages to the point that Venetian nobles began to commit demographic suicide. Running out of noble males to fill the offices of the Republican Empire, the Senate sold memberships in the nobility to provincial aristocrats, putting the lie to the principle that a republic of virtue could only be sustained by the genes of the ruling class. These fathers, she wrote, are tyrants from hell, monsters of nature, Christians in name and devils in deeds. How is it possible, she asked, to be so cruel as to torture the bodies of your daughters to the point that they are in danger of losing their very souls as well as their freedom? Rather than imprisonment in a cloister, it would have been better had the day of their births been the day of their deaths. Tarabotti's understandable tirades often dissolved into repetitive fury. But what made her so unusual was her ability to transmute that fury into an analysis of the sad social state of young women in Catholic Italy. These two early works, Convent Hell and Paternal Tyranny, I take it, represent the quote-unquote true Tarabotti with whom I want to converse. Now, keeping with my conceit of a conversation with Sister Arcangela, I imagine talking with her through the bars that separated all visitors from the nuns in the chaperone place of the parlatoio, that is, the hall where nuns could meet family, friends, and outsiders, such as a historian from the future. Tarabotti was known for her defense of women's fashions and in protest of the strict regulations for the cut of a nun's habit. She argued that female luxury is moral. Women have a duty, in fact, to embellish their own vanity. Outside the convent, Venetian women were fashion setters notorious for exposing their flesh, including even going topless to the casinos and opera, while maintaining anonymity by wearing a mask. The nuns tried to keep up by abandoning the obligatory woolen underwear for silk and lace, and most dangerously, for wearing low-necked habits that revealed too much. After a visit to another convent, the elderly patriarch noticed. He ordered, quote, that neither the breast nor any other body part should be exposed. Now, Sister Arcangela would have arrived at the Parlatoio gate with elegantly turned out in her black Benedictine habit. As a keen observer of Venetian couture, which set the standard for the rest of Europe, she certainly knew the latest fashions and used the Parlatoio to see and be seen. The Parlatoio was, moreover, vital for Tarabotti's aspirations to become a published writer. It was here that she exchanged books with other writers, listened to critiques of her drafts, and as her reputation grew, met prominent intellectual patrons who could act as go-betweens with publishers. The parlatorio became for her a place of tension, where she was perpetually reminded of what she was missing in the outside world, and a place also of moral support, where she conversed with influential women and men who took her ideas seriously and helped her publish books less shocking than her unpublished first two. Now, the closest the historian might come to a conversation with the dead is the letter, as Petrarch suggested in his epistles to the ancients. After Tarabotti published the Anti-Satire, one of her screeds against misogyny, male critics argued that no woman was capable of writing so well. In response, she published a collection of letters as evidence of her erudition. The letter from form established what seems on the surface a private conversation between writer and recipient, a written version of a conversation. Tarabotti's letter book is, like those of her contemporaries, a crafted means for establishing her place in what would later be called the Republic of Letters. And she took advantage of the epistolary collection to breach the convent's walls. In one of her letters, she asked for help in finding a book titled The Soul of Zeno, the supposed biography of the late Renier Zeno, who died in 1647, the Venetian senator notorious for his criticisms of the Holy See and the Roman Curia. But the book, in fact, never existed. Rumors that such a book might have been privately published were likely an attempt to misdirect the gaze of the religious authorities to censor the book, or perhaps it was just a joke at their expense. She searched ardently for this unfindable book because, as she wrote, "I am curious to speak with the souls of dead men, for, to tell the truth, one hears nothing but lies from the living." Like Petrarch and Machiavelli before her, conversations with the dead offered candor. For Petrarch, it was fidelity to good Latin and ethical principles. For Machiavelli, realistic political models. And for Tarabotti, alternatives to the prevarications of male-dominated Catholic Venetian society. Subject to strict censorship by the abbess, letter exchanges involving nuns required outside help to evade convent restrictions. Her most important link to the outside world became her patron, the influential Giovan Francesco Loredan, who was the dedicatee of her letter collection. Her brother-in-law, Giacomo Pighetti, probably introduced her to Loredan, who was the founder of the libertine anti-clerical Academy of the Unknowns, of which Pighetti was also a member. In their writings, the Unknowns anticipated my thesis about conversations. Their intellectual style consisted of oral presentations followed by debate, which they called conversations. The historian Gina Pinzoni ungenerously satirized them as garrulous cicadas gathered in the academies. There they recited with great precision their blatherings, and then they published them. Now, I think his criticism does not do justice to their novelty and anticipation of modern semiotic theory, and oddly, of course, echoes the Catholic enemies of the Unknowns who deployed the pejorative label libertines to describe them. Tarabotti's connection to Loredan and the Unknowns made her career as a writer. Of her 256 published letters, 70 were to members of the Unknowns, but her relationship with the all-male Unknowns was fraught. The Unknowns thrived on iconoclastic debate, often at the expense of women. And some members adopted, as I mentioned, a libertine stance towards sexual mores. Despite their fascination with this nonconformist nun, some of her so-called friends among the Unknowns taunted her and ridiculed her defense of women. Even her patron, Loredan, often disappointed her. Among the unknowns was my final interlocutor, Ferrante Pallavicino, who served as Loredan's private secretary and who depended on the older man's financial help and protection. Now, both Tarabotti and Pallavicino depended on the patronage of Loredan and the unknowns. Both evinced an abiding hostility towards the forces of oppression in their time, and both were members of religious orders. But in other respects, they differed dramatically, not the least in their attitudes about gender. Tarabotti was the proto-feminist and Pallavicino the arch-misogynist. They were near exact contemporaries. Tarabotti lived from 1604 to 1652, and Pallavicino from 1615 to 1644. They lived in the same city, and both were known literary figures. But I have no evidence that they ever met. I doubt, in fact, that Tarabotti would have invited the notorious libertine into the convent of Sant'Anna. Nevertheless, they certainly knew about each other's works, and in her writings, Tarabotti attempted to refute Pallavicino's misogyny. Abandoned by family and friends, the nun Tarabotti wrote books and letters seething with a sense of personal betrayal. Irascible, irresponsible, and irreverent, the friar Pallavicino wrote books seething with personal mutiny against his church. An engaging writer, Pallavicino published a remarkable 26 books between 1635 and 1640. More than you needed for tenure, I think. They were extraordinarily popular, not just in Italy, but also in Protestant circles abroad, where they were available in English, French, German, and Swedish. Born in Parma to an old but down on its luck aristocratic family who had ceded authority over their territories during the previous generation, Pallavicino followed the usual pattern for dislodged Italian aristocrats by finding a living in the church, in his case as a Lateranense canon. Pallavicino took vows at age 16 before he had a chance to taste, as one of his admirers put it, the carnal delights of liberty and the pleasures of the world. His order seems to have been unusually lax. While still a teenage novice, he took leave from his prayers and studies to visit the houses of the order in France. But instead of going on a religious pilgrimage, he scampered off to the loose morals of Venice, took up with a woman, and wrote disingenuous letters to his superior describing the sights of France that he never saw. He dabbled in a few courses at Venice's University in Padua, where he wrote a flattering panegyric of the liberties of the Republic, which put him under the protection of the Venetian Senate, thereby enabling him to engage in his intellectual crusade against the three pillars of the Counter-Reformation: the Society of Jesus, the Habsburg monarchy, and the Barberini papacy. After he returned from Padua to Venice, he enjoyed comfortable lodgings in the monastery of his order, which now houses the art galleries of the Accademia di Belle Arti, spent a few hours writing each morning, and cavorted with prostitutes in the evenings. Echoing the unknown's conversational methods, Pallavicino's writing style provided an ideal cover for his extreme views. The unknowns valued wordplay, indeterminacy, and especially the idea that language is dynamic. But that dynamism can be lost in the fixed text of a printed page. To compensate, the unknowns, like many writers in Renaissance Italy, fashioned their texts as dialogues. Galileo Galilei's dialogue concerning the two chief world systems from 1632 adopted the dialogic ploy to argue for Copernicanism. But in his case, it did not work. The book led to his arrest, trial before the Roman Inquisition, and permanent house arrest, where he would eventually meet John Milton writing is a dangerous pursuit in the Counter-Reformation Italy, as Pallavicino would discover. Keeping a poker face for controversial ideas became a kind of parlor game for the unknowns, who employed pseudonyms and complex metaphors. Hiding the truth through calculated dissimulation from the poisonous eyes of the ecclesiastical authorities followed an ancient maxim that poetry must protect the truth from the vulgar, who would not understand it. By his own account, Pallavicino was a satirist, not a theologian or a philosopher. But satirists since Erasmus have probably altered public opinions more quickly and more broadly than the serious thinkers. The question that arises from Pallavicino's satire is exactly what form of religious skepticism it represents. His books depicting the Roman Church as unredeemable included The Rhetoric of Horrors, which lampoons the society of Jesus in the manner of Pietro Aretino by having an older prostitute give lessons to a neophyte that are paraphrases of passages from the rhetorical manual read in the Jesuit schools. And this didn't fool anybody. Excuse me. In the Celestial Divorce, Jesus asked God the Father for permission to divorce his bride, the Roman Church, because of her intolerable adulteries. And in the Baccinata, which condemned the Barberini papacy and called on the European princes to attack Rome, depose Pope Urban VIII, and organize a general council. Pallavicino's argument was a practical appeal to the conciliar tradition within the church, but the new council should be strictly subordinated to the princes of Europe to punish a vicious, corrupt pope, a hearkening back to the imperial opposition during the investiture controversy of the 11th century. Now, in his heavy-handed satire, Pallavicino managed to slip in a deeply subversive idea. The church should be subject to the secular powers, which we better guardians of morality than the popes. It was a complete rejection of the core principles of the papal monarchy that was, of course, a Protestant idea embraced most clearly by the Lutherans and Anglicans. Pallavicino's highly personalized satires of high church officials were his undoing. A secret agent working for the Pope's nephew convinced Pallavicino that no less a personage than Cardinal Richelieu wanted to employ him as an official historian and invited him to France. Pallavicino followed his betrayer right up to the gates of papal Avignon, where he was ambushed, imprisoned, tried, and convicted for lèse-majesté. The papal authorities ordered his head chopped off and his body dumped in an unconsecrated grave. He was 28. His capital crime was not heresy, but his refusal to acknowledge the Pope's universal sovereign power, the very claim that had enraged Pallavicino and his Venetian friends the most. Of that crime, he was certainly guilty. How was this savvy rebel, who fooled his monastic superior and ingratiated himself in the highest circles of the Venetian aristocracy, so gullible? Now, I am not the first to imagine a conversation with the dead Ferrante Pallavicino. He was such a remarkable personality, and his death so threatening to others who prized intellectual freedom, that soon after his execution, someone published a book called The Soul of Ferrante Pallavicino, which became the most virulent attack on the Catholic Church to come from the circle of the unknowns and probably anyone who was not a Protestant. The conceit of the book is exactly the theme of this talk, that the soul of the deceased Ferrante Pallavicino returned to earth one evening to carry on a conversation with an old friend named Enrico. The book was published anonymously with a false place of publication and dated 1643, that is, the year before Pallavicino was executed, certainly all in an attempt to obscure its true origins. There are clues that the author was Loredan himself, Pallavicino's patron, who had once used the pseudonym Enrico Giblet, and thus the book may be an imaginary dialogue between the living Loredan and his deceased young friend. Now, in the dialogue, Ferrante and Enrico feed off of each other's skepticism, progressively making ever more radical attacks on Christianity, as might happen in a real conversation between two like-minded friends who egg each other on. They talked about how the scandals of the Curia have encouraged infidels and heretics to see the Christian religion as superstition. It has become so bad that Pallavicino's soul in heaven reports that not a single pope has been saved since Sixtus V, the reform-minded pope who loathed the Jesuits and limited the size of the College of Cardinals, but who had died in 1590, more than half a century before. That placed the intervening 8 popes in hell. Now, the soul of Ferrante Pallavicino navigates beyond the unknown's usual satire to enter theologically treacherous shoals. Enrico asks Ferrante, how is it that souls, which are without bodies, can be subjected to physical penalties after death, such as the torments of purgatory and hell, so often described in sermons and depicted in paintings, and central to Catholic theology's disputes with Protestants? After all, it was precisely the non-biblical doctrine of purgatory that prompted Martin Luther to pen his 95 Theses against indulgences. To render souls capable of feeling physical pain, they must have organs. But if, after death, souls can feel pain without bodies, then there was no need for God to have given them bodies in the first place. Enrico posits that the only solution to this logical problem is to reject the belief in suffering souls after death and to accept that the only real punishment after death is the deprivation of divine grace. Pallavicino's soul, who's just come down from heaven, however, disagrees with Enrico's assertion of the power of grace. Many theologians have argued, as has Enrico, says Ferrante, but his own experience with execution leads him to report that bodily death is much worse than the deprivation of salvation, which is, of course, a belief contrary to all Christian thought. Without life, one does not have the capacity to comprehend the state of glory God so supposedly grants through grace. In other words, the recently deceased Pallavicino claims, we value salvation only because we value life. We only imagine salvation because we do not want to lose life. Pallavicino and Enrico move on to discuss the Last Judgment. Pallavicino argues that to condemn many souls to eternal punishment would be to contradict God's mercy. They both agree that all souls in possession of reason, the divine gift that distinguishes humanity from animals, would be saved. If only a few were saved, then the incarnation of the Word would be useless and without infinite value. Infinite mercy would not leave room for anyone to be damned unless they lost their humanity through the absence of reason. And it is very true and constant that men do not sin, as Pallavicino says, with the intention of offending God, but to satisfy their appetites. They are not made any less guilty by punishment, which is incompatible with the infinite mercy of God. The satisfaction of bodily desires is a persistent theme in Pallavicino's life and writings. Despite the evident truth about divine mercy, Pallavicino says, the Christian religion instills fear, indeed even the fear of a madman. The only solution, therefore, is to recognize, and here's the most radical statement, men have the ability to establish laws over God. Now, that's a radical claim. If humans can impose laws on God, then what is God? Does God have any influence, let alone power over human events? Pushed further, would there be any reason for there to be a God except as the deists claim as the prime mover of the universe? Now, whoever wrote the book was no Voltaire. The intellectual framework of the Sola Fronte Pallavicino follows the model of Dante Alighieri's The Divine Comedy, a visit between the living Dante and the dead soul Virgil, rather than the possibilities opened by the new world or the new science. The Sola Fronte Pallavicino is a prime example of the possibilities of unbelief without the accoutrements of modernity. Now, in this talk, I visited 4 conversations with the dead, emulating Sister Taraboti's desire. As she put it, I am curious to speak with the souls of dead men, for to tell the truth, one hears nothing but lies from the living. I approached the dead through quite diverse methods, from scratching for tiny clues in the archives to expanded interrogations of the published writings of people who had literary ambitions. Each method yielded very different results. What I know about the Sienese and Friulano peasants is accidental and fragmentary. They had little interest in the future beyond the survival of their children. Their interest lay in the necessities of the farm, the family, and the moment. Tarabotti and Pallavicino wanted future attention for their ideas and looked to the printing press to find it, thereby catching my notice from the very distant future. Now, following the OED, a conceit is an elaborate, playful, or ingenious artistic device or concept. Does the conceit of a conversation with the dead amount to anything more? Is it a method? And if so, what does it achieve? Machiavelli's letter, quoted at the beginning of this talk, suggested that having a conversation with the dead ancients, however imagined, allowed him to glimpse their humanity through what we might call empathy. In his letter, Machiavelli was singularly revealing of his own humanity, his injured merit, financial worries, life reduced to card games with rustics, and dependence on old friends. What I feel most profound is the psychological liberation he himself found in historical research, because it is the kind of liberation I also find in the paper-laden imaginative space of my study. My conversations were not encounters with ghosts who came with a message for the living, but engagements with documents that have offered access to the words, thoughts, feelings, and actions of those who lived in the past and that might answer my own curiosity about the truths of the dead. I do not consider the method as a form of proof or a demonstration of why one interpretation might be better than another. The dead do not have agency in these conversations, or perhaps only the agency the documents and I grant them. What the dead represent is not so much their place in some historical schema as their, their individuality, or perhaps their shared experiences with a small group. A conversation with the dead is not a microhistory or a biography. It is just a conversation. The conceit of the conversation helps keep everyone in their proper place. The dead are dead. The living historian has the voice, the agency, and the opportunity to reanimate the dead as an object of empathy and to give them back their humanity. The dead do not serve the present. They serve themselves, their own time, and their own social situation. They are not our servants. Let them rest in peace, not fight our battles for us. Only they can speak the truth about themselves through the evidence they have left. And like Venice's literary known, I too want to hear the truths the dead can tell us. Thank you.
We invite you to join us for the reception in honor of Dr. Muir next door. Thank you.